The moment I realized how little I had ever meant to them was not at a funeral or a courtroom. It was years earlier, standing in the corner of a polished living room, holding a paper plate, at a Christmas party I was never meant to feel welcome at. I was 56 then, divorced, quietly rebuilding a life I hadn't planned to live. My ex-husband's new wife Lorraine stood near the fireplace with her 2 children, laughing loudly. Glasses raised their voices, carrying over the music. They didn't look at me. They never did, unless it was necessary. My daughter Hannah stood beside me, shoulders stiff, pretending not to notice the way Lorraine's son rolled his eyes when Hannah spoke. The way Lorraine's daughter whispered something and laughed under her breath. "They think we don't belong," Hannah murmured. I squeezed her hand. "We're guests," I said, though I knew that wasn't true. Guests are invited. We were tolerated. After the divorce, my ex-husband Richard had remarried quickly. Lorraine came with money, confidence, and 2 children who learned early how to measure worth. Hannah and I came with second-hand furniture, careful budgets, and a history they preferred to erase. They never missed a chance to remind us. Birthday invitations that arrived late, holiday dinners where our seats were placed at the far end of the table, conversations that stopped when we entered the room. Lorraine once joked, smiling sweetly, that Hannah had inherited her mother's modest ambitions. I laughed politely. I always did. Richard said nothing. Over time, the message became clear. Lorraine's family was the present. Hannah and I were the past. An obligation he fulfilled out of guilt, not affection. When Hannah graduated college, Lorraine's son announced his promotion during the same dinner. Applause followed. Hannah's achievement passed like a footnote. When Hannah struggled to find her first job, Lorraine suggested she lower her expectations. I watched my daughter absorb each insult quietly. And every time I told myself that dignity meant restraint, I was wrong. Years later, Richard fell ill. Not suddenly. Slowly. The kind of illness that gives people time to rearrange their loyalties. Lorraine took control of everything. Doctors, finances, information. I wasn't asked to help. I was informed. Hannah tried to visit, but Lorraine insisted on scheduling. "He needs rest," she said. "Too many emotions are bad for him." Too many emotions meaning us. When Richard died, the call came late. The funeral arrangements were already made. Lorraine told me where to sit. Not with family, with acquaintances. I remember the sound of the organ, the stiffness of the pew. Hannah's hand gripping mine as Lorraine and her children took the front row like it had always belonged to them. I thought that was the final humiliation. I was wrong again, because a week later, we were summoned to the lawyer's office, and everything they thought they owned was about to turn against them. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old paper, the kind of place where secrets had been spoken for decades without raising voices. Hannah sat beside me, her posture straight, jaw set, as if preparing for impact. Lorraine arrived last, dressed in black that looked expensive without trying. Her children followed, confident, bored, already discussing what they planned to do with the house once everything was settled. They barely acknowledged us. The lawyer cleared his throat and began. He spoke carefully, methodically, as if laying down tracks before a train arrived. Richard's estate, his assets, his will. Lorraine smiled faintly. She reached for her daughter's hand. Then the words changed. "The primary beneficiary," the lawyer said, "is Hannah." The room shifted. Lorraine frowned. Her son straightened. Hannah's breath caught. The lawyer continued unbothered. Richard left the full financial estate valued at $32 million in trust for his daughter. Lorraine laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. "That's not funny," she said. The lawyer looked up. "I'm not joking." Silence slammed into the room. Lorraine's smile vanished. "There must be a mistake." "There is not," he replied calmly. Her son stood abruptly. "She didn't earn that." Hannah said nothing. She was trembling. The lawyer raised a hand. "Please sit. There's more." Lorraine's face had gone pale. "I'm his wife." And the lawyer said, turning a page, "The marital home is bequeathed to Margaret." He looked at me. For a moment, I didn't understand. "To me?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "The house is yours." Lorraine stared at me like I had just spoken a foreign language. "That's impossible," she whispered. "That house is mine." The lawyer folded his hands. "Richard purchased it prior to your marriage. He retained sole ownership." Her daughter began crying. Her son started shouting. Words like manipulation and betrayal filled the room. Lorraine turned on me. "You planned this." I met her eyes for the first time in years. "I didn't know," I said honestly. The truth was simple. Richard had planned it alone. The lawyer explained further. Letters, instructions, conditions Richard had documented long before his illness worsened. His regret, his silence, his attempt too late to correct years of imbalance. Hannah finally spoke. Her voice shook. "Why didn't he tell us?" The lawyer sighed. "Some people try to make amends quietly." Lorraine slammed her hand on the table. "This will not stand!" I looked at her, then truly looked. At the woman who had dismissed us, minimized us, erased us. And I realized something with absolute clarity. For years, they had believed we were nothing. And now, nothing was about to take everything they thought was theirs. The tables had turned, and this was only the beginning. Lorraine didn't scream. That surprised me. She went very still, like someone who had learned long ago that losing control in public was weakness. Her children, on the other hand, unraveled immediately. Her son paced the office, muttering about lawsuits and unfairness. Her daughter cried openly, mascara streaking down her cheeks, anger and humiliation mixing together. Hannah sat frozen beside me. I could feel the tension in her arm through the sleeve of her coat. This was not triumph for her. It was shock, layered over years of being told she deserved less. The lawyer waited until the noise burned itself out. Richard anticipated resistance, he said calmly. "That's why the will is extremely specific." Lorraine finally spoke. Her voice was controlled, but there was steel underneath it. "My husband would never have done this without pressure." The lawyer slid another document forward. "These letters are in his handwriting, written over several years, before his diagnosis." He didn't hand them to her. He read excerpts aloud. Richard wrote about regret, about watching his daughter shrink at family gatherings, about how easy it had been to let silence become cruelty. He wrote about Lorraine's influence without naming it directly, about fear of confrontation, about cowardice. I closed my eyes. This was not revenge. This was confession. Hannah's shoulders began to shake. She covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling silently. I wrapped my arm around her and pulled her close, something I hadn't done in years, because she had grown so used to standing on her own. Lorraine stood abruptly. "This meeting is over," she snapped. "We'll contest everything." The lawyer nodded. "You're within your rights." She turned toward Hannah. "Enjoy it while you can." Hannah looked up then. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I didn't ask for this." Lorraine's expression twisted. "You existed." That was enough. They left without another word. When the door closed, the room felt emptied of oxygen. I sat back slowly, my legs weak. "Is this real?" I asked. The lawyer met my gaze. "Very." Outside, Hannah leaned against the building and cried like a child who had finally been allowed to be hurt. I held her while people walked past, unaware that 2 lives had just shifted on their axis. "I feel guilty," she whispered. "For what I asked? For winning?" I shook my head. "You didn't win. You were seen." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from memory. Every dinner where Lorraine corrected Hannah's grammar in front of guests. Every holiday where Hannah received gift cards while the other children opened boxes of expensive electronics. Richard had watched all of it and waited too long. By morning, the first message arrived. Lorraine's lawyer, formal, aggressive, predictable. The war had begun. The first thing Lorraine tried to take back was dignity. She spread a story quickly. That Richard had been manipulated, that Hannah was greedy, that I was bitter, poisoning my daughter against her own father's family. Friends we shared suddenly went quiet. Invitations stopped. Phone calls went unanswered. I recognized the tactic. Erase us again. Only this time we had something they didn't expect. Proof. Lorraine filed to contest the will within days. Her children signed on eagerly. The claim was undue influence, emotional manipulation, compromised judgment. The irony almost made me laugh. Our lawyer warned us. This will get ugly. I've survived worse, I said. Hannah moved into my apartment temporarily. Not because she needed shelter, but because she needed space to breathe. The money was locked in trust until the case resolved. Lorraine couldn't touch it. That made her furious. She tried another angle. One afternoon, she showed up at the house. My house. I was there packing boxes, slowly, deliberately. The locks hadn't been changed yet. The place still smelled like her perfume. She walked in like she owned the air. "You don't belong here," she said. I set the box down and faced her. "According to the will, I do." Her eyes flicked around the room. "This was my home." "You lived in it," I replied. "There's a difference." She laughed coldly. "You think money makes you important?" "No," I said. "I think truth does." She stepped closer. Richard was weak. "Yes," I agreed. "And you knew it." Her face flushed. "You always wanted what I had." I met her stare. "No. I wanted my daughter treated like she mattered." She raised her hand as if to slap me, then stopped herself. Her breathing was shallow. "This isn't over," she hissed. I nodded. "I know." After she left, I sat on the floor and let the silence settle. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't afraid. I was done shrinking. The court date was set. Depositions followed. Emails surfaced. Text messages. Financial records showing how Lorraine had limited Richard's access to Hannah under the guise of peace. The narrative began to crack. Hannah struggled with the attention, with being painted as a villain for finally being acknowledged. One night she asked me, "What if we give some of it back?" I took her hands in mine. "They didn't hesitate to take from you for years. This isn't theft. It's correction." She nodded slowly. As we prepared for court, one truth became impossible to ignore. Lorraine had built her power on our silence, and silence was no longer available. Court does not feel dramatic when you are sitting in it. There is no music, no raised voices like in the movies. Just wooden benches, fluorescent lights, and the slow, grinding sound of truth being forced into the open, whether anyone likes it or not. Lorraine sat on the opposite side of the room, perfectly composed. Her children flanked her dressed like they were attending a business meeting, not a fight over a dead man's conscience. They avoided Hannah's eyes completely. That told me everything. Their attorney painted a familiar picture. A vulnerable man. A bitter ex-wife. A daughter manipulated by resentment and greed. He used words like influence, pressure, confusion. He never used the word neglect. When it was our turn, our lawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He laid out emails Richard had written but never sent, journals he had kept privately, notes documenting how often Lorraine discouraged visits, delayed calls, reframed exclusion as keeping the peace. Then came the testimony that shifted the room. Richard's longtime accountant took the stand. He spoke plainly about how Lorraine had redirected financial conversations away from Hannah, how Richard had asked repeatedly about setting something aside for his daughter and been told it would cause tension. A former nurse testified next. She described how Richard had asked to see Hannah during a hospital stay and been told she was unavailable, only to later learn no one had contacted her at all. Lorraine's jaw tightened. Hannah was called last. She walked to the stand with her shoulders squared, hands steady. She didn't dramatize. She didn't accuse. She spoke about birthdays, forgotten calls, unanswered invitations that never came. She spoke about learning to lower her expectations to survive. "I didn't want his money," she said quietly. "I wanted my father." The courtroom was silent. Lorraine's daughter wiped her eyes, but not from sadness, from fear. When Lorraine testified, her composure finally cracked. She insisted she had protected Richard from conflict, that she had managed relationships responsibly, that Hannah had been distant by choice. Our lawyer asked one question that changed everything. "Did you ever ask Hannah what she wanted?" Lorraine hesitated. "No," she said finally. That was enough. The judge recessed for the day, but the damage was done. The story Lorraine had controlled for years no longer belonged to her. Outside the courtroom, reporters hovered. Lorraine refused to comment. Her son cursed under his breath when he saw them. Hannah said nothing and kept walking. And in the car, she exhaled like she had been holding her breath for a decade. "I feel lighter," she said. "So do I replied. That night, Lorraine's attorney requested a settlement discussion. For the first time, she wanted to negotiate. Settlement talks are where power shows itself most clearly. Lorraine no longer spoke through confidence. She spoke through calculation. Offers were floated, percentages shifted. Proposals framed as generosity were quietly insulting. She wanted Hannah to accept a reduced share. She wanted me to vacate the house quickly without ceremony. She wanted control without accountability. We declined everything. Our lawyer was firm. "The will stands. You're not in a position to demand concessions." Lorraine didn't like hearing no. She showed up at Hannah's workplace unannounced. Security escorted her out. She sent messages through extended family painting herself as the wronged widow being stripped of her future by a spiteful ex and an ungrateful daughter. The smear campaign intensified. It didn't work the way she expected. People began asking questions, quiet ones, the kind that unravel carefully curated reputations. Why hadn't Hannah been at holidays? Why had Richard's relationship with his daughter been so distant? Lorraine couldn't answer without telling the truth, and the truth didn't flatter her. The judge issued a preliminary ruling weeks later. The will was valid. The trust remained intact. The house transfer would proceed as written. Lorraine's face when she heard the decision was something I will never forget. Not rage, not grief, disbelief. She had built her life on the assumption that we were weak. That assumption had cost her everything. Moving into the house was surreal. I walked through rooms filled with memories that weren't mine. Lorraine's furniture, her taste, her sense of ownership. I didn't rush to change anything. I let the space breathe first. Hannah helped me pack the rest of my things from my apartment. We laughed more than I expected, not from joy, but from release. "You know, she said they always acted like we were lucky just to be included." I nodded. "They confused tolerance with power." Lorraine sent one last message before blocking us entirely. "You may have won the money it read, but you lost the family." I read it twice, then deleted it. Because here is the truth she never understood. Family is not something you lose when it finally stops hurting you. That night, Hannah and I sat on the back porch of the house, the one Lorraine had once called her kingdom. The air was quiet, the future uncertain, but finally, ours. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow. I felt visible, and that was more powerful than anything money could buy. Winning in court does not immediately erase the damage done before it. That was something I learned slowly in the weeks after the ruling, as Hannah and I tried to settle into a life that finally belonged to us. The money was still locked in trust, managed conservatively, the way Richard had specified. The house, however, was real, solid, heavy with other people's memories. At first, I moved through it carefully like a guest afraid of overstaying. Lorraine's presence lingered everywhere, in the arrangement of furniture, in the sharp scent of her candles, in the framed photos that still lined the hallway showing a version of family that never included us. Hannah noticed it too. "It still feels like we're trespassing," she said one morning standing in the kitchen. I nodded. That's what happens when you're treated like an afterthought long enough. You start apologizing for taking up space. We began reclaiming the house slowly, intentionally, not out of spite, but necessity. The photos came down first, not torn or smashed, just placed carefully into boxes. Lorraine's designer furniture followed sold or donated. We kept only what felt neutral, honest, empty enough to breathe. That was when the first letter arrived. No return address, just my name written in a tight, familiar script. Lorraine. Inside was not an apology. It was an accusation disguised as grief. She wrote about betrayal, about how Richard had humiliated her, about how Hannah had stolen what never belonged to her. She ended with a warning. Money reveals who people really are. I folded the letter and set it aside. She was right about one thing. It did. The second letter came a week later, this time addressed to Hannah. She didn't show it to me right away. I found it crumpled in the trash one evening. What did it say? I asked gently. Hannah hesitated. That I ruined her children's lives. That I should give it back if I had any conscience. I took Hannah's hands in mine, just as I had when she was small. Conscience is not the same thing as compliance. She nodded, but I could see the weight settling in her shoulders. Being seen had come at a cost. Being resented for it was new. At the trust office, we met with the financial advisor Richard had chosen years earlier. A woman close to my age, calm, direct. Your father was very clear, she told Hannah. This isn't a reward, it's a correction. Those words stayed with us. Correction, not punishment, not revenge. Balance. Lorraine's children tried one last tactic. Public sympathy. Social media posts about losing their home, about wicked inheritance battles, about being cast aside. The comments were not as supportive as they expected. People asked questions. Why wasn't Hannah ever mentioned before? Why did the will exist at all? Why did Richard feel the need to make such a specific choice? Silence followed. That silence felt different this time. It felt like accountability. One night, Hannah admitted something she had never said out loud. I used to think if I just stayed quiet, they'd eventually accept me. I kissed her forehead. They accepted your silence, not you. The house grew warmer with each small change we made. New curtains, softer lighting, a table where Hannah and I actually talked instead of performing. Lorraine faded from our daily thoughts, even if she hadn't faded from her own anger. But something else began to surface. Relief. And underneath it, a question neither of us had voiced yet. What do we do now when survival is no longer the goal? The answer didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces scattered across ordinary days. Hannah took time off work for the first time in years without apologizing for it. She slept. She read. She walked the neighborhood without headphones, noticing the world instead of bracing against it. I did something I hadn't done since my divorce. I invited people over, not out of obligation, not to prove anything, just because I wanted to. Friends came, some who had quietly drifted away when Lorraine's version of the story dominated social circles. Others who had always believed us but never known how to help. They walked through the house carefully at first, then relaxed when they realized this was not a victory lap. It was a beginning. One afternoon, Richard's sister visited. She stood in the living room, eyes damp. I didn't know how bad it was, she said softly. He never said it out loud. He wrote it instead, I replied. She nodded. I wish he'd been braver. So do I said, and I meant it without bitterness. At the trust office, Hannah began participating in decisions. Not extravagance, structure, sustainability, education funds, charitable planning. The kind of money management that assumed a future, not a payoff. Watching her sit at that table confident but cautious, I realized something quietly profound. They had underestimated her because they never bothered to know her. Lorraine attempted contact one last time through a mutual acquaintance. A request to talk, to clear the air. I declined. Not every chapter needs closure through conversation. Some end cleanly when you stop turning the page. At Thanksgiving, Hannah and I cooked together. No audience, no comparisons, no tension humming beneath the surface. As we sat down to eat, she raised her glass and smiled. To being included, she said. I shook my head gently. To belonging. Later that night, I walked through the house alone. The floors creaked differently now, as if adjusting to new footsteps. I touched the walls, the door frames, the places where Lorraine once stood, certain she would never lose control. Power built on exclusion is fragile. It collapses the moment its targets stop believing they deserve it. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, one thought settled fully in my chest. We were no longer reacting to injustice. We were designing a life, and that, in its own quiet way, was the most complete form of revenge. Justice does not arrive with celebration. It arrives with adjustment. That was the truth I kept returning to as autumn settled in and the legal dust finally stopped drifting through our lives. The trust finalized its first annual report. Everything was in order. Conservative investments, clear protections, long-term thinking. Richard had planned this carefully, even if he had failed to act sooner in life. Hannah read every page. She asked questions. She learned the language of control instead of surrender. Watching her was its own kind of healing. For years, Lorraine and her children had spoken about money like it was proof of worth, like abundance belonged to those who demanded it loudly enough. Hannah treated it differently. She treated it like responsibility, like a tool that could either repeat harm or interrupt it. She chose interruption. One afternoon, she came home with a quiet expression, thoughtful rather than excited. "I want to fund scholarships," she said, "for kids who were written off. Not big announcements, just help." I nodded. "Your father would have approved." She looked at me carefully. "Do you think he knew how bad it was?" I didn't answer right away. Some truths take time to say without wounding. "I think he knew," I said finally, "and I think he was afraid to admit it out loud." She absorbed that in silence. Lorraine's absence became noticeable, not because she was missed, but because the tension she brought with her was gone. No more bracing, no more anticipation of criticism, no more rehearsing responses in advance. But absence does not erase consequences. One evening, Hannah received a message from Lorraine's daughter. Short, sharp, accusatory. "You ruined our lives." Hannah showed it to me without comment. I read it once and handed the phone back. "You didn't ruin anything," I said. "You survived a system that required you to be invisible." Hannah exhaled. I keep wondering if I should explain myself. To whom I asked gently. She didn't answer. That was the answer. At a small dinner with friends, someone asked me if I felt vindicated. I considered the word. "No," I said. "I feel finished." Finished explaining. Finished shrinking. Finished waiting to be acknowledged by people who only understood power when it left their hands. The house felt fully ours now. Not because Lorraine's things were gone, but because our rhythms had replaced hers. Music? Hannah liked playing softly in the evenings. My books stacked in places I could reach without apology. Laughter without monitoring volume. One night, standing at the kitchen sink, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older. I also looked free. That combination felt earned. The holidays came quietly that year, without spectacle or strain. For the first time in decades, I didn't dread invitations. I didn't calculate seating arrangements in my head or brace for passive remarks disguised as humor. Hannah and I decided to stay home. Just us. No explanations required. On Christmas morning, we exchanged simple gifts. Thoughtful ones. Nothing meant to impress anyone else. As we sat with coffee, Hannah asked a question I knew had been forming for months. "Do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" I understood what she meant. Differently enough that we never had to learn these lessons. "Yes," I said honestly. "I wish you had been treated with kindness when it mattered most." She nodded. "Me too." But I continued, "I don't wish away what we've learned, or who we've become." That was the truth. Later that week, Richard's lawyer sent a final letter. Administrative, neutral. Closure in legal form. It marked the official end of all disputes. I filed it away and felt no urge to revisit the past. Lorraine had moved to a smaller place across town, according to rumors. Her children struggled to adjust to lives without automatic privilege. I didn't take pleasure in that, but I didn't look away either. Karma is not cruelty. It is alignment. One afternoon, Hannah and I walked the neighborhood together. She talked about her plans, about travel, about building something meaningful that didn't revolve around proving herself to anyone. "You know," she said, "they always thought we were weak." I smiled. "They thought quiet meant empty." She laughed softly. "They never listened." "No," I agreed. "They talked too much to hear anything else." As we reached the corner and turned back toward the house, I felt something settle that I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, completion. The story that had defined us through exclusion, contempt, and dismissal no longer belonged to them. It belonged to us. And as we walked home together, side by side, I understood something clearly. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like a life rebuilt so fully that the people who tried to diminish you no longer fit anywhere inside it. Power has a way of revealing itself long after the courtroom lights turn off. It shows up in choices, in what you tolerate, in what you no longer explain. By early spring, Hannah had settled into a rhythm that felt unmistakably hers. Not rushed, not defensive. She spoke differently now, slower, more deliberate, as if she no longer needed to prove the weight of her words. I noticed the change in myself, too. For years, I had introduced myself as someone's former wife, someone's difficult past, someone whose relevance ended when another woman took my place. Now, when people asked about me, I didn't frame my life around absence. I spoke about what I was building. One afternoon, Hannah came home visibly shaken. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at nothing for a long moment. "They asked me to meet," she finally said. Who I asked, though, I already suspected. Lorraine and her son. "They want to talk. They said they're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable. I didn't answer right away. I watched Hannah carefully. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She was tired. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She shook her head. "I don't know. Part of me wants them to finally understand. Another part of me knows they won't." I reached across the table and took her hand. Understanding isn't something you can negotiate. And closure doesn't require consent from the people who caused the harm. She let out a breath she had been holding. "So it's okay if I don't go." "It's more than okay," I said. "It's healthy." She declined the meeting. The response was immediate and predictable. Accusations, guilt, warnings about regret. Hannah read the messages once and deleted them. That act, simple and quiet, felt heavier than any court ruling. At a dinner party later that month, someone asked Hannah how it felt to suddenly be wealthy. She paused, then smiled politely. "It doesn't feel sudden. It feels overdue." I watched the room shift. Not everyone was comfortable with that answer. Women aren't expected to name injustice so clearly, especially when it's been corrected. Afterward, Hannah whispered, "Did that sound harsh?" "No," I said. "It sounded honest." That night, I lay awake thinking about Richard. About the years he spent avoiding conflict. About the price of that avoidance. He had tried to make things right at the end, but the cost of silence had already been paid by others. I resolved something quietly then. I would never again be polite at the expense of truth, and I would never teach my daughter to be. On the anniversary of Richard's death, I went to the cemetery alone. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't rehearse speeches in my head. I stood there in the morning light and allowed myself to feel whatever arrived without judgment. Grief came first, not sharp, not overwhelming, just present. Then something else followed. Acceptance. Richard had failed us in life. That was true. But he had also seen the damage before it was too late to try to correct it. His will was not an act of revenge. It was an admission. And admissions matter. When I returned home, Hannah was already awake, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I think I finally am." She nodded, understanding without needing details. That afternoon, we hosted a small gathering. Friends, neighbors, women who had followed our story quietly, recognizing pieces of their own lives in it. No speeches, no explanations, just connection. One woman pulled me aside and said softly, "I wish I'd had your courage." I shook my head. "I wish I'd had it sooner." She smiled. "But you had it when it mattered." That stayed with me. Later, as the sun dipped low and conversation softened, I watched Hannah laugh with people who saw her clearly without comparison or dismissal. She belonged here, not because of money, not because of inheritance, because she had always deserved to. If there is a lesson in this story, it is not that patience will eventually be rewarded. It is that silence protects the wrong people. Family drama often hides behind politeness. Betrayal wears the mask of fairness. And women are taught to endure instead of confront, to minimize instead of name injustice. But here is the truth I learned too late and will never forget. You do not owe loyalty to people who require your invisibility. You do not owe gratitude for crumbs. And you do not owe peace to anyone who built comfort on your exclusion. Revenge does not always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like inheritance redistributed. Sometimes it looks like a house returned. Sometimes it looks like a daughter finally standing in her full worth. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, especially if you were taught to keep it small. And if you want to hear more stories about family drama, betrayal, justice, and karma finally catching up, stay with me, like, subscribe, and come back. Because the truth they hid has a way of finding the light.